But Matt, I want to ask you, like, do you see environmentalism changing in response to these presses? I guess another way of asking this would be, do you see, in response to all the contradictions and trade-offs of the transition, it being useful to continue to pursue this political idea called environmentalism, or is it worth pursuing a totally different idea that might be more, evocative?
Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, a lot of the activism is revolving around climate, right? And people, when you talk a lot about climate, say you have carbon tunnel vision, you're not thinking about biodiversity, you're not thinking about all, and I think that's important. But I've noticed with the youth climate movement, with younger people, there's just more desperation and therefore more openness to nuclear. Like, I think there's a sort of emerging young activist pro-nuclear climate movement, right? And they're, I think, rightly just totally confused why we're shutting down these zero carbon plants in the midst of a planetarium. We're like, what is happening, right? So I think that is encouraging. I think there clearly was a moment politically with the rise of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s and an anti-nuclear movement that converged very powerfully. But I think we're starting to see that generationally kind of shift. Now, I will say the nuclear question, I think, really is a wedge. And so you do have a lot of these green groups that are advocating shutting down, like Diablo Canyon, right? And then when you look at who's wanting to keep Diablo Canyon open, one of the strongest activists that are literally holding rallies are the workers in the power plant, right? Who rallied and actually were part of this core constituency to keep it open, right? And in New York, where I'm from, the closure of Indian Point really angered the unions and workers in that sector, and now they really don't like the environmentalists for stuff like that, right? So it's really, I think, a problem. Environmentalists, like I put up the 100% renewable thing. I mean, if you want good unionized jobs, nuclear power plants employ hundreds of people. They're usually unionized. They're family-sustaining jobs. Whereas solar and wind installation projects are temporary construction jobs, usually very precarious, usually non-union. And so that kind of industrial policy thing that to try to reinvigorate the working class and union movement, I think it has to have a role to play for these more industrial technologies like nuclear that can actually employ people. The example I often give is in Texas, they're building a solar farm that will have 1,800 union jobs to build it, but when it's done, it's 2 jobs, 2 permanent jobs. And that's not gonna revive a community, right? Because it's harnessing the sun for free. It's cool, right? But not cool for jobs. The last thing I'll say to this materials question is I know Breakthrough Institute people have done research to show nuclear, from a material standpoint, is as efficient. It uses way less material, whether it's uranium or all the other stuff, than particularly solar and wind, right? And so I've often joked that if you're into degrowth and you want to lessen the amount of material throughput, well, nuclear is good because it uses less land, it uses less materials, and it really will reduce the throughput of the energy system by going to nuclear. One last thing. We just built a nuclear plant in Georgia, Vogtle, and it's exciting, but it cost a lot, and it was put on the backs of the ratepayers. Mm-hmm. And that model, which your recent podcast discussed, which I found fascinating, of just throwing all these costs onto the rate base is not gonna lead to more investments because the rate base gets angry at the rates going up. So we have to find a way to finance this stuff with a more progressive taxation approach that taxes the rich to fund all that kind of investment like FDR did. Thank you.
PUC reform now is what we need.